afternoon. Welcome to the Week in Review. And, the Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, this week delivered last week actually, delivered his speech on the medium-term budgetary policy framework. I think many people were hoping that he'd be pulling some kind of rabbit out of the hat. I think if he did, then it's probably a dead rabbit, or at least very comatose. But I've got two much brighter people to talk on that today. And first of all, Professor Yanni Rousseau, who's the head of Wits University's School for Economic and Business Sciences. Yanni, welcome. And glad to have you here. And then, of course, you can see another well-known person here on the program is Dawie Rood, who's from the Efficient Group, their chief economist, and been on the program before. So, gentlemen, let me ask you then straight out. Dawie, dead rabbit or a semi-comatose one?
Hello, good evening to you, Cobus, and good evening to you, Yanni, also. And I can just tell you, we've just had a huge storm around the house here. If there's some noise, my apologies about that. Fortunately, I've got some proper electricity backup because we cannot trust Eskom to keep the lights on during these sort of circumstances. And certainly we cannot trust the ANC government to prepare a proper budget. And that's indeed what this medium-term budget policy statement was about. I think it's important to understand that this is not really the forum to change policy. What this basically is an opportunity for the Minister of Finance to report back on state finances, but also to give us a bit of a glimpse on what can be expected in a budget next year in February, because that is the actual platform where policy changes is likely to be announced. Before this medium-term speech of the minister, it's also known as a so-called mini budget. But before this, everybody expected it to contain only bad news, and that's indeed what the case is. I think one or two things that are important. The one is, I can certainly sense a political change in government. And secondly, and that's just a little bit more technical, the Minister of Finance, where he previously drew a line in the sand saying that the debt levels will be stabilized in 3 years' time at 87% of GDP. He's broken that promise, and now his aim is to stabilize it at 95% in 5 years' time. So I think from a technical point of view, that is important, that specific number, that he couldn't hold his word for that specific number. And maybe just a general comment, I think just about all the numbers, all the estimates of the Minister of Finance in a budget is probably far too optimistic, and the things are probably going to look substantially worse than what the Minister of Finance is predicting at the moment.
Yanni Rousseau, that's one of the worries that people have been talking about, is that the promises made by the minister and by government seem to be unrealistic, to put it mildly.
Yes, indeed, Cobus. The government is long on promise, short on delivery, with a budget deficit keeping increasing, and with a debt GDP ratio approaching 95% of GDP. South Africa is facing a real debt crisis and a real possibility that the country might indeed default on debt repayment, even on interest payments on debt, that we will simply not be able to afford that. That will, of course, have very serious implications for South African pension funds in particular, who pension funds are large investors in government bonds. At the same time, I should really just early in this program say it makes no sense to give another 10.5 billion rands to SAA. SAA is nothing but a vanity project of the South African government, and specifically a vanity project of the ANC. And we are really throwing good money after bad. Closing it down with the implications will be cheaper than to take money from other projects and try to keep SAA in the air. The government should have done that 5 years ago when I recommended it for the first time.
We'll get back to that one a bit later on. But Dawie, I want to get back to you because you briefly referred there to political issues behind this budget. Maybe that's where we can go put things into perspective first.
Yeah, Cobus, what I meant by that is that the subject called economics used to be called political economy for obvious reasons, because whatever happens in politics affect the economy. They're the guys setting up policies, and they're the guys doing the damage to the economy usually. And it's important to understand what's going on in the ANC. And I think we're all aware of the fighting in the ANC, in the tripartite alliance, in fact. The last couple of years, we've been seeing more and more of that. There's some uncertainty as far as leadership is concerned. There's ideological uncertainty. And I think very importantly, there's uncertainty regarding the relations between, especially whoever is in charge of government, and organized labor. I'm referring specifically to COSATU. So those were the tensions that were there previously. I'm just giving the background quickly. Secondly, the Minister of Finance is a very important minister in cabinet. It's always been the case. He's really a senior guy. And the budget delivered in February is basically a law and has never been sent back. So everybody accepts the Minister of Finance's final say on finance. So what is clear to me, what has happened, especially last year or so, is that the budgetary process, or let's call it fiscal policy, has moved away from Treasury and more to the union buildings. And that is important because Tito Mboweni has been demoted, as far as I'm concerned, and Pravin Gordhan has been promoted, and he is also the second Prime Minister in South Africa, after Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, perhaps. So he's been promoted in a way. That means that one cannot really, whatever Tito Mboweni says, and he actually said that himself, he says, I have to stay within my line, to use his words. So whatever he says as the Minister of Finance, we have to understand that from now on going forward, really depends on whether Pravin Gordhan and the President is going to agree with that or not. Tito Mboweni himself, he had his own economic plan, which was simply ignored, and the President provided and promoted his own economic plan, which differs from that of the Minister of Finance. So I think the political changes that took place here is that the Minister of Finance, the Ministry of Finance has been really gutted to an extent, and the Minister of Finance himself, Tito Mboweni, has been sidelined, and in fact I believe Tito Mboweni is not going to be around that much longer. So who is in charge now? We have a bunch of socialists in the form of Pravin Gordhan and certainly the President himself, and that is certainly not good news for us. So Tito Mboweni lost the fight, Pravin Gordhan won the fight, and I think that really links on very nicely with what Yanni had to say about South African Airways. And that's the reason why they try to keep South African Airways in the air. Tito Mboweni is very much against that. He said that numerous times, and now he says he's going to stick within his line. And Pravin Gordhan, of course, is a guy saying, I'm so happy we're going to give more money to South African Airways. So the ideological point I think I'm trying to make here has shifted certainly to the left. So this is a further left-leaning budget than what we had previously, which is very unfortunate. I think Tito Mboweni is the best guy that the ANC can provide as the Minister of Finance, and he has been sidelined, and that is to the detriment of South Africa and the South African economy.
To add to that, to the worry around that, on our previous program, we also had somebody who knew, or one of our previous programs, I think 2 weeks ago, we had somebody who knew or knows Tito Mboweni very well. And looking at what happened after the budget this week, the minister took a road trip, of all things, back to Tzaneen, where, according to Jordan Hill Lewis of the DA, he's actually hiding out in a sense. He's withdrawn himself from the day-to-day running of the Treasury and things that ministers should be doing. So that's something that South Africans should be exceptionally worried about. And that combined, as you said, Pravin Gordhan used to be a very popular minister, but I think what people did was, personally, and Yanni, I'd like your opinion on this, but I get the impression that what we did is we confused honesty with capability, with ability. As a Minister of Finance, Pravin Gordhan wasn't a good Minister of Finance to start with. Yanni?
Well, Pravin Gordhan is at least honest, and in the Zuma administration, any honest person really had to get our support because there were so many dishonest people in cabinet. But Pravin Gordhan is, as Davi has said, a socialist, very left-leaning in politics. But without dwelling on SAA, the basic problem at the moment is that we are borrowing huge amounts of money to balance the budget. We call it the deficit before borrowing, but we are borrowing money from our children and by now, by the looks of it, even from our grandchildren, because the interest on this money that we now borrow will have to be repaid over generations to come. So that's a very serious burden that we put on future generations at the moment. At the same time, as I've said, there is now really a possibility of the government defaulting on its borrowing, not being able to pay the interest on the borrowing going forward, because there will simply not be money for it because the tax base is eroded. And then it is also important to note that the minister in the MTBPS stated that the economic activity will decline by 7.8% this year. He then gave growth projections for 2021, 2022, and 2023. If you work that out on the lower base after the decline of this year, it means that by the end of 2023, the contraction of 2020 will not yet be sort of eradicated. So at the end of 2023, South Africa's economy will still be smaller than by the end of 2019. At the meantime, our population will continue to grow at 1.5% per annum, and the demand for service delivery and other services from the government will simply continue. So the government is really in a precarious position, and therefore we need to see deep cuts in certain activity in government. And the deep cuts, of course, have to start at civil service remuneration, where we are no longer able to afford our civil service. And I must add, my wife is here in the house, and she's a civil servant. She's a school teacher. So when I say these things, I'm not very popular here at Bogey Street. That's why I've asked whether Davi's at his office, whether I can visit him afterwards.
But you know, we saw COSATU now coming out and saying, look, we're quite willing to present this plan to our members and talk to them about it, on condition that we also see a similar sacrifice by the president and by his ministers and all the other senior people who are on those big fat salaries. And I must say, to a certain extent, I'm quite sympathetic towards COSATU. Government cannot expect only the rest of us, the ordinary citizens, to sacrifice after we've already sacrificed a hell of a lot over quite some years now. We've got to see the same sacrifice from other people.
Because I fully agree with you. That's why I'm very excited by the statements the minister made around salaries of executives at state-owned enterprises that got completely out of hand, and they get bonuses that are completely out of hand while those state-owned enterprises make losses. So this sacrifice should also extend to state-owned enterprises. And then, of course, we can't only talk about the salaries of cabinet ministers, etc. We should also talk about their perks. We should talk about the perks of our envoys overseas. I don't know whether any of you have seen today's Sunday Times with our envoy in Los Angeles not happy with the house the government wants to buy. The envoy expects more. So the sacrifices must be made at all levels. And as you know, I've often said before that the government should only buy vehicles made in South Africa. There's no reason why cabinet ministers can't be transported proudly South African. But these things do not get traction because it's sacrifices, but they must make the sacrifices. We are the privileged few. I just want to pick up something else that Darby said about the ANC. We should never forget that the thing that keeps the ANC together as a political party is the list system of elections we have in South Africa. If it was not for the list system, the ANC would have split a long time ago. But at the moment, the ANC cannot split because some faction in the ANC will be able to continue to call itself the ANC and will have the majority of the seats. So it's the seats that the ANC holds in national parliament, in provincial parliaments, and in city councils, that these seats hold the party together. There's nothing else keeping it together. It's just a bunch of thieves masquerading as a government, keeping these seats under their control.
But also the employment of a huge number of civil servants, Yanni, because 46% of the tax revenue goes to paying civil servants.
Sorry.
Those are cadres who will keep on voting for a government that does that.
Yeah, sorry, Cobus, that percentage is now up to 60%. It used to be 46%. It is now 60%.
There we go.
Because tax revenue is much lower than what it was before.
Darby?
Yeah, let me just add to that, Cobus, a few things I would like to say. First of all, since the beginning of the year, we've lost 2.5 million jobs in South Africa. All those jobs were lost in the private sector, all of them. Not a single one was lost in the public sector. All of them were private sector jobs lost. Now, I've done the numbers. The average public official is significantly better remunerated than the private sector equivalents. There are 21 million people receiving an income from the state every month now, today. There are roughly just over 2 million civil servants if you include the provinces and the state-owned enterprises and the local authorities, so just over 2 million. And there are currently 14 million people, well, actually 12 million people if you only look at the private sector. So 12 million people are actually funding 21 million people directly every month. Those are the sort of numbers. Now what we have organized labor, and I think that's one of the issues that we need to that we have to consider, and they have to be resolved in government. Whoever's in charge of government's got to somehow find a way to manage organized labor, especially COSATU. Now I agree with Yanni with his list argument, but there's a slightly different angle to this that I believe is also valuable, and that is the whole thing that we call government, or even South Africa, is actually held together by the taxpayer. The taxpayer everything comes together in the budget. The budget, as far as I'm concerned, goes to the heart of a democracy. Now, the guys receiving on the receiving end that get the money are the state-owned enterprises and, of course, the civil servants. We know this. They're getting much more out of the system than what they actually put into the system. While the guys contributing to the system, the taxpayers, they are starting to make some noises. We can see it in all sorts of numbers. So-called tax buoyancy is under pressure. You cannot really increase taxes that much. So the point I really want to make is that I will not be surprised if the Minister of Finance succeeds in cutting back on his spending, especially in state-owned enterprises, which is also a patronage system, as well as the wage bill. It is quite possible that the tripartite alliance can eventually start falling apart. In fact, it has fallen apart to an extent already. And that may actually realign or shuffle the political landscape in South Africa to a large extent. So, and perhaps that's not a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing necessarily, because I think it's totally unhealthy for organized labor to be in government with government governing organized labor, just specifically the civil service. So I think we could be in the beginning of the end of the tripartite alliance and a total realignment of political interest in the country. I just want to come back on a comment that Yanni made about the possibility of the state defaulting on its debt. I don't think that is going to happen. I think it's very unlikely for that to happen, simply because that the bulk of South Africa's state debt is actually rand denominated. And I believe that the pressure on the Reserve Bank is going to build up over the next couple of years like we haven't seen before. And I think the Reserve Bank simply won't have a choice, but simply to allow for inflation to get out of hand, because inflation is a very nice way of paying off your debt as well. So those are 2 points. I think the point where we are now could actually be the beginning of a new political dispensation in a way in South Africa, or at least alignment. And secondly, I also believe that the pressure on the Reserve Bank in a year or two's time is probably going to become unbearable.
Yanni, I still want to go back to the fiscal cliff because you mentioned it earlier in the program. And that's something that you forecast with your colleague from UNISA some time ago, 5-6 years ago. When was that? And it was a long-term view then, but going up according to what you're saying, this fiscal cliff thing isn't too far in the future if we can't get things turned around, or as Darby says, if we start printing money to pay government debt.
Yeah, we did this work in 2014, and when we published the work, just based on what we've seen, we were really criticized all over the board, specifically by the government. And all we said is show us where we are wrong, and nobody could show where we were wrong. And we then predicted the course of how this will play out to 2020 and 2025, and this is what we're seeing happening. Now, what worries me, Cobus, is I saw this happening. Fani Uber and I were right, and we didn't get wealthy out of this. So there's something wrong in the system. If this prediction can be so accurate, at least Fani and I should be able to retire wealthy.
But perhaps just explain to our viewers what you mean by a fiscal cliff, because not everybody's, I think, au fait with that expression.
Yeah, we use the term fiscal cliff as the point where civil service remuneration plus interest on government debt plus social grant payments, those three components, which are incidentally all consumption expenditure components of the government's budget, will exceed 100% of tax revenue of the government. Incidentally, it will happen this year because tax revenue dropped substantially. It will be better next year, but at the rate we are going, we are going to be in a permanent fiscal cliff by 2025. So in short, it's the point where civil service remuneration plus interest on government debt plus social grant payments exceed 100% of tax revenue.
I'd like to have a look at possible solutions, other alternative solutions from both of you. But I'd also like to underline, first of all, just to get back to Pravin Gordhan and his initial 10.5 billion going to SAA now. And I think I saw other figures saying that in the end, we're looking at something like 22 billion. And I just would like to underline the fact that this is money that should have been going to schools. This is money that should have been going to school laboratories, libraries. It should have been used to eradicate the whole pit toilet system, where we've seen kids die as a result of bad maintenance. So this is money that should have been going and would have gone to positive things in a way. And this is being thrown at SAA. So again, the priorities of government actually takes one's breath away, because there doesn't seem to be any realism involved in this.
Well, in short, Cobus, this government talks of billions as if it's small change. I mean, R1 billion is a lot of money. 10 billion rands is 10 times a lot of money. So if I've worked out that if you increase the tax brackets on every income tax, in every income tax bracket above the bottom one of 18% by 1 percentage point, and you add a new tax bracket of 50% on taxable income above 2 million rands per annum, you will probably raise something like 15 million rands extra per annum. We give 2/3 of that huge extra tax burden to SAA as if it is nothing. Or I shouldn't say tax burden, that potential tax burden. We give 2/3 of that to SAA as if it's small change. Something is seriously wrong in respect of SAA. Yes, I call it a vanity project, but there must be more to SAA. Perhaps some people still have an opportunity to steal money there, and that must be protected. There must be something going on at SAA that I simply don't understand. It's probably something that an investigative journalist can look into why the government is so adamant to keep SAA in the air. There must be something that I cannot understand.
Dawie Rood?
Yeah, Cobus, maybe Yanni, you made a mistake. You said 15 million. You meant 15 billion with a B.
Sorry,
But
15 billion. Thank you, Dawie.
Yeah, Cobus, I've been analyzing the fiscal accounts for many decades, in fact. And if a minister of finance is not a thief, it doesn't mean he's a good minister of finance. And if you look at the various ministers of finance that we've had in South Africa, Pravin Gordhan was probably the worst minister of finance by a very, very long shot. And I can give you all the numbers, but during his reign as Minister of Finance, he doubled the state debt levels. He was the guy overspending on a wage bill. He was the guy overspending on the state-owned enterprises. And yes, of course, there was the financial crisis, there was Zuma and all sort of other things, but he was in charge of the checkbook. It is his fault. And now today, Pravin Gordhan is the Minister of State-owned Enterprises himself, and he continues with that. He prevents the various boards and management at the various state-owned enterprises from doing what they're supposed to be doing. That's the reason why the guys left at Eskom and why they left at South African Airways, because they wanted to restructure. And he said, no, he interferes. And he interferes, only a reason that I can think of is because of ideological reasons. And that's where we find ourselves today. And Yanni mentioned we need another couple of billion. That 10.5 billion number was calculated at the time when there were certain assumptions on the airline industry. Now, those assumptions are outdated by now. And the most recent numbers that I've seen is that if you really want to get South African Airways to fly, you can't give it just 10.5 billion. You probably need to give them 20 billion or even more. So this is not going to be the end. And in the meantime, we've given them something like 40 or 50 billion already. So if you ask me why they keep on doing this, I just cannot think of a reason. I think it's just, it could be some personal pride thing of Pravin Gordhan. It could be an ideological reason, maybe, or what. I cannot think of a reason. And they're wasting another 10 odd billion rand, while South Africans are going home at night hungry. They're going to bed hungry. They are South Africans. We've got a huge increase in poverty in South Africa, and they keep on giving this sort of money to South African Airways and other parasitals. I call them the parasitals. I do not have an answer to that. I just don't know.
Okay, well, I'm going to start with you while you're there. Let's look at this. Let's make you Minister of Finance now. And what are you going to do? I mean, you get saddled with what we've got now, with the debt levels, the everything, and they say, well, Dawie Rood, you've always been a very good economist. You're now minister. How do you solve it?
Yeah, making me Minister of Finance is probably not going to be enough. You have to make me not even president. You have to make me some sort of dictator. But okay, let's assume, let me make a statement here. I promise you, Cobus, I promise you, civil servants will be paid less over time. I promise you that. They are going to be paid less because the Minister of Finance is going to cut back on the wage bill, or they're going to be paid less because their money is going to be worth less. We call that inflation. So they will be paid less, I promise you, because at this rate, we simply kind of going on at the rate that we have been going on. So if I was the Minister of Finance, you have to cut back on the wage. You have to spend less money on people. That's the bottom line. That includes state-owned enterprises and on the wage bill. And inevitably, people are going to get angry at you. So it's not an economic question. It's not even a question about the budget. It is a political question. How are we going to get away from making certain adjustments and in the process get a lot of people from getting angry at you? Because that is essentially the question. How are we going to manage that? And the politicians, being politicians, they do not want people to get angry at them. But people are going to get angry, inevitably, doesn't matter what. But technically what we need to do, we have to cut back on spending quite dramatically on the wage bill and the state-owned enterprises. You cannot increase taxes anymore. And of course, we have to privatize and we have to close down a lot of these state-owned enterprises. So the economic or financial answers are easy. The difficult one is the political one.
Yanni?
Well, I agree with Dawie on the civil service remuneration bill. I will put a total moratorium on appointment of new civil servants for at least 5 years. I will close a number of government departments, and I will start with the Department of Sport. I have no idea what they did during the lockdown. There was really no sport. I will close down all non-essential, non-performing state-owned enterprises like Denel, Alex Core, SAA. I will get legislation passed that all government contracts from municipal level to whatever level will be published for public scrutiny. And likewise, Eskom will be forced to publish every contract that it enters into for public scrutiny. So, I mean, that should keep me busy for the first week. So then in the second week, I will visit Mr. Kieswetter and I will ask him, what can we do to improve efficiency in tax collection? And then at the end of the second week, I will abolish all remaining exchange control, which will show confidence in our future. That will be a step of confidence like Margaret Thatcher did 40 years ago in the UK. It will turn the narrative. It will show that South Africa believes in its own future. So, Cobus, and then after 3 weeks, I'll probably be fired, but then I've done enough.
Well, by the way, Yanni, I would really appreciate if you cut all taxes based on any form of capital. So capital gains tax, any kind of transfer duty, any estate duties, all those capital-based taxes, get rid of those as well while you're at it.
The question that comes up though is if we could do this, and we're looking at Tito saying that he's going to dramatically cut expenditure on salaries for civil servants. You both said that that's got to happen. You've got to have a huge reduction in the number of people working for the state. But looking at the current situation with millions and millions of people already jobless in this country, certainly this step will also add to that number. How far? I'm thinking of the social unrest, the tensions that we are going to be creating in this process. It needs to happen. I've got no doubt. But how dangerous is this period that we're going into the next couple of years, you think?
Can I answer that?
Cobus, I just want to say in short, at the same time, you will have to make it easier and more attractive for small people to do business, and hence you will have to change labor legislation to make it more attractive to employ people in the private sector. At the moment, it's so unattractive to employ people because there's such a structure of labor legislation, it practically makes it impossible for you to employ people. So it's easier not to employ. We must make employment easier in the private sector.
Darby?
Yeah, Cobus, let me add to that, and it's a bit of a technical argument, and that is that many, especially on the left, they talk about Tito's budget as a so-called austere or austerity budget, which he certainly is not. A budget that is what we have currently is a hugely expansionary budget. We've had a hugely expansionary budget for many, many years, and it still is. This is not an austerity budget whatsoever. So we have to move into getting this budget to become an austerity budget. And unfortunately, if we do what Yanni and myself, what we are suggesting, this huge continuous injection of new capital into the economy coming from the state will come to an end. And it will lead to a lot of pain, and it will actually deepen the economic difficulty in which we find ourselves at the moment in the short term. And that's the difficult part, because it is going to exacerbate a very difficult economic situation in which we find ourselves today. And it is going to exacerbate that because we do not have a choice anymore. We are not in a position where the state can support the economy. We're well past that because of this mismanagement of the fiscal accounts in the past. So in a very unfortunate way, if we do what's supposed to happen, we are actually going to cause a lot of pain in the economy, which is simply inevitable. But the longer we postpone that, the more the pain is going to be in future than even what it is going to be today. And that is what Yanni and myself and many other economists have been saying for many, many years, that take the necessary steps. Take the necessary pain, because it's not going to be easy. But the longer you wait, the harder it's going to become. Now it's going to be much harder than last year. And next year is going to be much, much harder than this year. The sooner we take these difficult steps, the sooner we take the pain, the better for everybody.
That's Darby Rood, Efficient Group Chief Economist. We also spoke to Professor Yanni Rousseau. He's the head of WITS's School for Economic and Business Sciences. I want to thank you both for taking part this afternoon. And well, if you haven't slit your wrists yet, you probably want to go and have a drink now or something. But I do believe that South Africans still, somehow or other, we've always muddled through. And somehow or other, I'm sure that we will do it. But certainly it's going to be a hard time waiting for us. So don't get your hopes up too high immediately. My name is Cobus Bester, and we'll speak again next Sunday, 5 o'clock. Bye-bye.